Suppose you're given y equals negative 6x divided by x plus 5. And your goal is to find the inverse function. So part A is find the inverse. And it's symbolized by f negative 1 of x. Now that does not mean that we raise our equation to the negative 1 power, but we're going to find the opposite function. So what's the process in doing so? First, interchange your x and your y. X equals negative 6y over y plus 5. Next, multiply both sides by the denominator. Distribute, leaving you with xy plus 5x equals negative 6y. Next, our goal is to find y. So I collect all y's on the left side, giving xy plus 6y equals negative 5x. Again, I added 6y to both sides. I subtracted 5x to both sides. Factor out y, since it appears in both terms. Next, divide both sides, leaving us with y, which is our inverse. And that's negative 5x divided by x plus 6. So that's the process to find the inverse. Interchange x and y, solve for y. Now, the next question that arises in precalculus is, what's the domain of the original function? Okay, so let's just remember the original function y, or f of x, was negative 6x divided by x plus 5. So the domain is a set of all x values for which the function is defined. Now the function is undefined when the denominator is 0. So the value of x such that the denominator equals 0 would be negative 5. So again, the domain would be the set of all x such that x cannot be negative 5. Part 2 of the domain, well, they could ask what's the range of the original equation. Now, this requires some theory or some background knowledge. So throughout your pre-calculus career, you've probably noticed that you've been asked for domain countless times. However, you're not really asked for range. This is because normally the only way to find range is to graph the equation and locate the minimum and maximum y values. So that range, or the height of the graph, is the set of all y values. But we could do another process. We could find the opposite of each. What's the opposite of range? Domain. And what's the opposite of f? Well, it's inverse. So let me just remind ourselves. The inverse was negative 5x over x plus 6. So the range would be the set of y such that y cannot be -6. And that's because, again, the domain of f, if I wanted the domain of f inverse, that would be x cannot be -6. So again, that's the domain of f inverse, but the question ultimately asks for range, and that's why we format our answer with y. So next would be part 3. Okay, what's the domain of the inverse? Well, we already answered that in part 2 of part B. So it's the same thing. X cannot be -6. Perfect. Part B, part 4. The last possibility is, what's the range of the inverse? Actually, let me just do this on a separate page. Again, we're asking range of inverse. Take the opposite. I'm interested in domain of inverse. Or should I say domain of f? But notice that's actually the first thing we were ever asked in part 1, the domain of f. So that would be our answer, but formatted with y. So all y such that y cannot be -5. So notice part 1 is always the same as part 4, and then parts 2 and 3 are always the same answer as each other.